Hi everyone, thank you all for joining us. This is a new episode of the podcast Hidden Layers, in which we are interviewing some of the top AI people around the world. Today we have the honor to have George Mathew with us from Insight Partners. We will speak about a lot of interesting topics about AI, investment, generative AI, and many cool topics. But before we start, hi George, how are you?
I'm good, Uri. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. And then, by the way, I love the name of the podcast being called Hidden
Yeah,
Layers. So it's very,
it took
very
me a
cool.
lot of time to think. I came up with the idea several years ago, and I said I have to do something with that. So for years, I've been planning to launch this podcast, and I'm happy to do that right now. So without further ado, just let's start with a short introduction. Tell us a little bit about your career, and what roles have you done until joining Insight Partners.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been now at Insight Partners as a managing director for the last 3 years, three and a half years
Mhm.
just working with Insight, but certainly 3 years as a member of the team. And as I've really known Insight a little bit longer from my operating background as a builder for many years prior, it's been an interesting and
Mhm.
incredible organization. As you know, most folks in Israel know, Israel has been a very strong source of
Mhm.
growth for Insight in particular for at least the last half a decade, if not longer. But this is a 28-year track record in history that Insight has built in terms of really just focusing on the growth within software. And in that regard, we do look for those opportunities globally and invest globally to the best founders who are really thinking through their growth journeys and having Insight be part of it. So I got to know Insight in a similar capacity when I was still at Alteryx as the president and COO of Alteryx. And of course, we were
Mhm.
building the last generation of data prep solutions into the scale that we've got in the mid 2010 timeframe. And as we started to see that opportunity in the mid 2010s, what was pretty clear was that there was this need for inflecting growth, right? And
Mhm.
Insight became a very critical partner in Alteryx's journey in really helping us find those growth trajectories, particularly in
Mhm.
terms of that data analyst persona and how to be able to really embrace them and help build a product and solution that eventually enabled us to take
Mhm.
Alteryx public in 2017. And about 4 years after taking Alteryx public, I was working on an industrial drone company called Kespri, and it was in the midst of finishing my fourth year was when
Mm.
Insight reached out to have me join
Mhm.
as a venture capitalist. In the context of being a venture capitalist in the last 3 years, my focus has been on everything related to the modern data stack itself in terms of how we think about observability and orchestration and just everything necessary to build a high fidelity modern data stack for enterprises, and then started to look at ML ops, LLM
Mhm.
ops, and generative AI applications. And so one of my first investments coming into Insight as a partner was of course weights and biases, which became one
Mhm.
of the de facto tools in the MLOps space. So that's a short version,
Yeah,
a longer history, but it gives you a sense of who I have been as a builder as well as now an investor.
sounds very, very interesting. You mentioned weights and bias. We've been working personally with our community, with many people from this great company. They are speaking with all our events, so I really like them and doing an amazing job. And you mentioned them. You also invested in Desi, an Israeli company. This is from the area of the MLOps, but you have also made an investment in companies like Jasper or DeepDub, also Israeli company. So you have the entire stack. And I want to ask you what you're actually looking for in the AI space when you are looking for a company. What really excites you? What you are looking for when you want to invest in AI startup?
Sure. When I first think about an investment, whether it's an AI company or not, and of course, as you can tell, I have a lot of focus in investing into AI companies, is I still do focus on the team itself, right? We do
Mm,
want to make sure ultimately that we have a high quality team that can really lead a company through the journey, and that of course starts with either the founder and or CEO, as well as the team that surrounds that founder and or CEO. And I think once you really do establish that baseline area of having a great team, then you can start to think about, okay, what's next, right? In terms of
mhm.
the investment thesis itself. And no surprise, the next piece of the investment thesis is there a large enough total addressable market, a large enough TAM
Mhm.
that makes sense? In most of the conversations, particularly around AI and data companies, the TAM is usually quite
Yeah.
large. And
Mhm.
so, when you use the example of weights and biases or use the example of Jasper, these are large markets where there's a need to be fulfilled. And once you get past team and TAM, then a lot of my focus and attention really goes into, well, what's different, right? What is that thing that you can now deliver into this market that is different from the status quo? And oftentimes it's hard to tease that out because companies, the founders, particularly early in their journeys, are generally figuring that out, right? They
Yeah.
don't necessarily know exactly what that differentiation might be, but we're trying to really tease that out early on in the journey. In the case of like weights and biases is a great example, or DESI is another great example. We saw very compelling differences in what Lucas was doing from a
Mhm.
experiment tracking, parameter tuning, version control perspective in terms of that capability set versus the status quo of what you would have to do that work as a
Mhm.
machine learning practitioner. And that was what was exciting about weights and biases, even early in the journey, that there were so many MLEs, machine learning engineers, machine learning practitioners, just adopting the use of weights and biases very, very early on in its product life cycle.
Mhm.
Deci, I think, was different, right? In a lot of ways, Jonathan had a
Mhm.
view of where the model performance had to be managed differently than the status quo. And in this case, the view was that you can introduce this notion of decimization, you can prune
Mhm.
trees, you can look at ways that models don't have to be as large as they are when they go into deployment. And as you work through the training and deployment, you can decimate a model, right? That's where the name DESI comes
Yeah.
from. You can decimate a model to prune the trees of the model in a way that you have as high performant of a model that requires less resources because it's a smaller model, it's more elegant, it's decimated effectively. And that's where Deci started its journey. I mean, Deci has certainly done a lot of things from that point on, but the initial idea was so compelling once you got past the idea of who the team was and what the total addressable market was.
Okay, sounds very, very interesting. So you said basically you're looking for the team, for the TAM, and after you have all those figured out, you want to understand what they can do different than other companies, what they can solve in a different way. And it leads me to the third question is, what do you think about all this generative AI hype? I saw that you made the last investment with a company in the field of agents, but I want to ask your thoughts about that in general, because many companies are now starting to enter this field. Many startups are now launching their own solution. It could be in the MLOps, but it could be also a B2C product. So what is your approach to that? And when you are looking for companies, you said earlier that sometimes it's difficult even for the founder to fully understand the product market fit, and it will take time for them to understand it. So, what is your perspective on generative AI startups, or what will be also the advice for companies who are looking for fundraising right now and will be maybe thinking, okay, what will be the best way for me to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no surprise that there's a tremendous amount of hype in generative AI right now, and
Hmm.
some of it is warranted,
Hmm.
and some of it is just overextending the opportunity that might be in front of us. And we just have to create in our own minds a balance of what the real sort of
Yeah.
excitement should be, and there is a lot of reasons to be excited. And I'll go into some of those reasons in a second, and balance that with the, well, is this being overhyped, right? Is this being overly stretched in terms of what the possibility of where generative AI is going to take us? I think first and foremost, you got to ground yourself in like what is different and why is it different and what we can do differently. I
Mm-hmm.
think the fundamental thing that I was excited by in seeing the generative AI applications that have emerged more recently, the infrastructure surrounding it, and just starting with the foundation models themselves, was that you're in a moment where you've reached the capability of a model, in this case, a transformer-based model, that has the qualities in an LM that can mimic human-like reasoning, and
Mm-hmm.
that capability of introducing a model that mimics human-like reasoning has been pretty profound. It's something that we haven't been able to achieve in
It's the
prior
holy grail.
iterations.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we haven't been able to see that in prior iterations of neural networks and specifically deep learning. And I think what's incredible to see in the transformer architecture is that as you continue to aggressively introduce more data, right? As
Mm-hmm.
in you tokenize and you train more in terms of the size of the models. And now we've reached, call it a trillion parameter large
Yeah.
language model with the GPT-4 style of model. The loss function in terms of the model degrading because it's not capable of accepting more data has not,
You reach the limit.
sort of attenuated. Yeah, it has been attenuated. So you continue to find improvements in a loss function, particularly as you drive more data into the model
Mm-hmm.
itself. And we'll see where it attenuates, right? It could be that this next generation of, call it GPT-5 style of model
Mm-hmm.
starts to degrade the models themselves, but you're getting better performance, better human reasoning, and better than human reasoning in some cases, and how these models have performed to date. And now, there's ways to think about different variations on that. You can get better constitutional AI against the model, which is what Anthropic is doing. You can get better segmentation in terms of building domain specific
Mm-hmm.
characteristics in the model. Say, for instance, that's what AI 21 is doing.
Yeah.
You can build smaller models, right? And that's where you're starting to see the small language models emerge, like the Mistral model
Yeah.
or the Llama 2 model. But I think the underlying point that I'm trying to make, that these models are different and its achievement of human-like reasoning, and you can now apply that human-like reasoning into all different forms of technology and software in particular. That's what's really compelling and exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I got to balance that with the, okay, well, that is a fundamental innovation and it's probably bigger than the internet, than
Yeah.
mobile and cloud. So there's plenty of reason to be excited. But at the same time, once this fundamental innovation occurs, how long does it take for that adoption to play out? And this is where we
Mm-hmm.
have to be careful, both as investors as well as founders in the journey, because yes, this has been introduced as a fundamental innovation in the market. One could say that a trillion parameter large language model is the most complex artifact created in human civilization, which would be a
Nice.
reasonably fair statement. Now, the thing that we have to think about next from that moment is get applied. In my world, it's enterprise software. I think about this as, well, how do we replace the rules engine surrounding software
Mm-hmm.
that's been in place? How do we think about the re-articulation of APIs so that it's no longer a concretized API with two endpoints associated with it, but potentially a reasoning oriented AI agent that might be on one or both sides of how the interaction occurs over time? How do we rethink, things around generative output that might be created for marketing purposes,
Mm-hmm.
for content generation purposes, for audio, video, that might be reimagined, like where folks like Runway are headed. And so I try to uh, really accept the fact that there is something fundamentally different, but then also lay out, well, how does that then change the specific domain, the specific
Mm-hmm.
industry that's involved? And I think the getting too far ahead of this is, and when it gets too hypey, is when you're presuming that just because this fundamental innovation is here, that everything is going to radically change tomorrow, which is not the
Mm.
case, but could likely change in the next decade. And how do you sort of time those changes over the next decade? That's where we're likely going to see the real value emerge. In the next year, everything is going to feel overhyped. In the next decade, I think we're
Interesting.
underestimating the possibilities of what's out of us.
You say so basically founders should not go and seek for a further vision that is far, far away in the future. They should focus in on what they can actually build right now and people could digest and actually use, because many things are going to change, but not that rapidly as we all think. Because this, as you said, it was fundamental change, but still we need to better understand how to build products around that and how to actually build something that people and enterprise will use. And you talked about enterprise, but this is the same logic for, let's say, more B2C, let's say, applications or products. Do you see any difference between that?
I
Or
do. I do. I mean,
yeah.
the fundamental technology, I mean, if we think about it, cloud before us, before AI, mobile before that, internet before that, had universal applicability across
Mhm.
B2B and B2C. This is the same, right?
Mhm.
AI definitely has universal applicability across B2B and B2C. I think the way I frame it is that in enterprise, you have to be able to introduce something that is at least 10x better than the status quo.
Gen
And
X.
and
Okay.
because like look, there's no
Otherwise, people won't
inertia.
consider to use that.
Yeah, there's not enough inertia. There's not enough desire to change the status quo unless there's something 10x better in the enterprise, right? And I think people generally will accept the desire to try something different if it's 10x better. And
Mhm.
look, we've seen that in waves of enterprise technology prior. I think in the consumer world, I think it's even harder in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, right? It might even have to be 100x better, right?
Maybe a
and
new
and
something. Sometimes it's not to do
or
more,
just
but
got
it's to do something else.
completely adding something that we haven't seen before, right?
Mhm.
And so I think we're certainly on the cusp of that, right? You're starting to see where a search engine could, for instance, could be reimagined
Yeah.
with a generative underpinning, right? And Perplexity is a good
Yeah,
representation
an
of that,
amazing
right? In terms
example
of
for
like
that. Yeah.
the incredible experience of what a new search engine could look like. You're seeing what a agent that works and lives alongside of you and provides advice to your day-to-day life could be, right? And that's
Yeah.
where inflection is certainly going with their capability as a consumer product. You're seeing the general purpose nature of which is what ChatGPT does, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look at what ChatGPT does to just improve just our own day-to-day productivity, whether it be
Mhm.
in enterprise or consumer. And so I think I'm giving good examples at this point of where these potential as much as 100x changes in the consumer experience and at least 10x experiences in the enterprise will really come out of this wave of generative AI. But you just have to think it through a little bit, right? You have to think through, well, in the enterprise, how does this then instill into the user experience of software products? How do we ensure that there's incredible workflows that are embedded into how a generative application functions or a generative model inside of a workflow behaves as it should? And so I think there's work to be done. I wouldn't get too overhyped about that. I would try to lean in and get the work done. But I think as we're getting that work done, I do believe again that we're at the beginning of a fundamental change that will drive humanity forward for the next decade or and beyond.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to move forward to the next point is talk a little about the moat, because many companies are now starting to build their own models. This is also doing an amazing job in that, training their own models, but also companies that you mentioned before, Mr. Al or even OpenAI. But on the other hand, we see companies that are just open source And Mosaic was a great example before they were bought by Databricks, and Mistral also releasing it for free. And many people are starting to concern and thinking maybe, this is not a mode. Developing your own model, this is something that could be nice in order to get some clients, lead, maybe a brand, but at the end of the day, it's going to be commodity. And no one is going to actually build something big around this specific technology because in several years it will be as a cloud. You can all just use and have your own, let's say, more servers, more virtual machines using the cloud and be agnostic to whatever you are doing. So my main question for you is: A, do you agree with that? Do you think that there is a mode or there isn't a mode regarding those technologies? And B, and if this is something you're considering when you are investing in companies that is doing really deep tech or something that is very focused on building this technology overview that maybe others won't have.
The moat being the model itself is going to be very difficult to maintain over time because
Okay.
when we started this journey with the introduction of transformers and the expansion of the GPT-3 style of model, the GPT-4 style of
Mhm.
model, it's very clear that there's a better experience coming about because of the use of the GPTs themselves and the experience of, say, for instance, ChatGPT as a UI around it. I think that it'll be tricky to keep the model itself as the mode over time because of the exact point that you made earlier. There's like just so much more proficiency in just being able to create models that have that human-like reasoning. Now, I think there is something to be said about a general purpose model at scale that is capable of helping humanity along in our
Mhm.
journey. And certainly that's the journey that OpenAI seems to be on as we speak. And they've been able to prove that their model with the data that they're training on and with the RLHF and RLAF feedback loops that
Yeah.
are improving the model over time is certainly got more than a sufficient head start, right, in terms of being the best model out there. The alternative path on this, and I don't think it's necessarily that one has to win for the other to lose, et cetera, et cetera. It's more that there is an alternative world of smaller models, right? And as we think about these smaller models, if you might be using the same human reasoning to improve your back office for how
Mhm.
trade processing and exception
Mhm.
handling in the back office in a financial services organization is, do you necessarily need to have all of the knowledge of 18th
Mhm.
century English history to be able
Yeah,
to
you
do
don't
a better
have
trade
that. Yeah.
processing? And my stipulation is you don't, right? You can likely take a model that has been more extensively built with, whether it be a decimalization technique like Desi's doing, or just a smaller model in general that has good enough human reasoning, but then you can now create domain specific training runs that enable you to get exactly what you would want a narrow AI use case to do
Yeah.
in the back office of a financial services organization. And so the reason why I don't think the models themselves are going to be where the moats are is because of exactly this point. I think we're going to have multiple models from small to medium to large that are going to coexist incredibly well. But ultimately, what is the real moat around this? It's actually going to be the data itself. If we think
Mhm.
about the data that is going into training a model, the data that's going into fine tuning a model, the data that's going into doing the necessary retrieval augmented generation around the model, all
Yeah.
of those things point towards the data moat being quite profound. And that's where I think there's going to be differentiation. And I definitely feel the case for
Mhm.
that differentiation in the enterprise. I don't know exactly how consumer is going to play out because it feels like there's, I'll call it
Maybe your own
a
personal
larger.
data. This is the data. You will have your own
Well,
custom.
that's interesting you say that, because on the consumer side, you're right. The most important data is our own personal data, right?
Yeah, your
And
own. Yeah.
so you can almost see a world where there is just a small form factor model, like a language model that sits on this
Yeah.
device, right? I know I'm blurred, but
I think it will be the
it's an
next
iPhone.
announcement from Apple. Apple is releasing it. There's a lot of packages, a lot of articles, running LLM on low memory. They're just telling us the big next thing for them is will be an LLM that is on your device, secured, private, and doesn't have to be that large.
It
As you
just makes
said,
sense,
if it's
right? It makes
specifically
sense.
for your own needs, it doesn't have to be maybe not 7 billion parameters, could be less.
Yeah, it makes sense that the world will still have these called personal LMs, and certainly one of the technology giants that should be closest
Mhm.
to creating a personal LM is certainly Apple, right? And so that makes a
Mhm.
ton of sense.
Yeah, and regarding that, I want to ask you, said that the data will be the main element here, and you mentioned that before about the segmentation of models. We see that companies are building, let's say, their own versions of those elements. It started with GitHub Copilot. This is some version of GPT. Then we saw
Mhm.
Bloomberg GPT. Even we saw MedPalm by Google is oriented to medical. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that the moat maybe will be with specific domain, the specific segmentations, as you mentioned, or you think that we will have like a general model, GPT 5, 6, 7, whatever, that will be strong enough to handle any test, no matter domain specific or not? What is your opinion about it? Do you think we are going headed to segmentation models or one big giant model that rule them all?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Uri. I'll confess to things that I really don't know the clear answer to, and this
This
is
is the
one of
same
those that I
answer.
don't know
This is funny.
the
Sorry for interrupting. This is the same answer that I have. For this specific question, I don't have any right or good answer.
So what I can lay out is the near term history around this, and perhaps what the history of the next sort of 2 to 3 years is going to be. The near
Hmm.
term history up to this point has been that anytime one of these step function evolutions in a GPT has emerged, a generative pre-trained transformer has emerged, is that those step function increases have obviated whatever the sort of fine-tuned domain specific model was in the previous generation. And I think we're going to have to prepare for this again, right? Because if
Hmm.
we think about it, there's going to be a fair degree of fine tuning and domain specific model creation surrounding the, call it, if you will, the GPT-4 style of model. And when I say GPT-4 style model, I don't just mean OpenAI, but I mean Anthropic and Cohere
Yeah.
and just, all the other models that have, emerged that are small form factor in nature. But when the GPT-5 style model emerges, right? Um, and we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, how many of these can we go further around in a moment. But I think consensus is there will be at least one more generation model of a
Yeah.
large form factor. And so when that sort of next generation of model emerges, I think it's going to be clear just from a historic perspective of what's played out already, that everything that's been built around a GPT-4 style of model from a domain specificity standpoint is also likely going to be obviated, right? Because of the performance
Mm.
of a general purpose model for around GPT-5. Now, here's the big caveat, right? It took somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of all of the publicly available human knowledge from a text basis to be able to build the GPT-4 styles of model, right?
Mhm.
And to see this exponential increase, right? The next 10x, shall we
Yeah.
say? Uh, I think we're actually going to run out of human publicly available corpus to train that
Mm.
model, because we're already at 20% of all the available
Data.
information on the public internet, right? So where are we going to find the next 10x improvement, right? Well, certainly, there's more, data to train a model off of in the public internet. But I think there's also just going to be other sources, private data, et cetera. There's going to be, multimodal sources like image
Mm-hmm.
video sources that are going to now be introduced. So regardless, I think there's a path to get to, just hypothetically say a 10 trillion parameter large language model or something in that nature. But I wonder out loud of a few things, right? One is, does the loss function start to degrade at that point? We don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Right?
Yeah.
Does will there be enough data to be able to achieve that 10x? We don't know. Most likely there will be, but then the question is like, there be enough to achieve the next 10x? Probably not, right? At least
Yeah.
with the currently available data. And then there's like other little things that we have to pay attention to in the middle of all this. Like one thing that we have to be aware of is a good degree of the newly created content on the internet today, publicly available content, is generative, right?
Generated by
It's
AI. Yeah.
actually
Mm-hmm.
so it's not created by humans. And so now we got to think about is this an Ouroboros?
Is it
Is
good
this
or
the snake
bad?
eating
Yeah.
itself? Right? Are we
Um,
going to run into model collapse at some point because there's too much non-human data going into the training of these models that are supposed to represent human-like reasoning? So
yeah.
I think we're, in for some really, really tricky questions, in the next half a decade or so that I've talked to a lot of AI researchers about some of these questions, and they don't even have what they would view as
Yeah.
reasonable answers in terms of how it's going to play out. And so that is actually one of the reasons why I'm just saying I don't know, because I've at
Yeah.
least thought about the questions, but I certainly don't have any of the answers.
Yeah. I totally agree. The thing is that I think that we will also need to justify it because even nowadays, if you take the common people and give them ChatGPT 3.5 or GPT-4, the majority of the task and the majority of the people won't be able to distinguish. Let's say you can solve probably the majority of the tasks that you need on day to day, except the reasoning and all the deep thinking with GPT 3.5. You can do a decent work with that. And this is another element. Let's say we have GPT-5. Is it will be hard for us to distinguish between the differences between GPT-4 and 5 and what will justify this huge amount of data and money and effort in order to do that? And maybe, as you said, maybe the solution is to segment and do it on fine-tune specific data. So this is also
That's
a
right.
very interesting question. If it's possible, this is one question. If it's worthwhile, maybe it doesn't. So
Well, I covered a lot of the is it possible questions. Hopefully, probably not all of them, but certainly one or two of the big key is it possible questions. Is it worthwhile is a whole other topic, right?
yeah,
And now we're kind of delving into the realm of philosophy. Um, it depends on what you think is worthwhile, right? Because if you think it's worthwhile to create a good enough intelligence that resembles and mimics
mhm,
humans and sits alongside of us and provides us for the things that we wouldn't want to do because it's just rote tasks that now are taken
mhm,
away from us because we have a personal LLM all the way to call it the GPT-5 style model available to us. That's one possibility, right? But then the question is it worthwhile to create a super intelligence, right? And it's something that
mhm,
could go beyond our own capability, and then all kinds of doors open up, right? It's like, well, then how are we aligning it, right? The alignment problem
yeah,
becomes a massive concern, right? What is the nature of that super intelligence and how it coexists with humanity?
mhm,
And so there's topics around AGI, which I don't know if we're going to necessarily achieve with this sort of current transformer architecture per se, but we're starting to get into the realm of, okay, it might not happen, in the near term in the next, 5 to 10 years, but certainly, within our lifetimes, there could be a
yeah,
view that continuing to iterate on the things we're iterating on could lead to something closer to an AGI. I didn't have a whole lot of belief in that, even 2, 3 years ago. And I would say, my own belief systems have changed, that I can kind of
Yeah.
see
And
the
this is even
possibilities
mind-blowing that
play
we
out.
are talking about that in our lifetime we will reach AGI. Even if this small debate, it's mind-blowing because, as you said, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, no one would ever think about that. This is even close. And now we're speaking about, yeah, maybe it's possible. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, a few years ago, my PDUM was what like pretty much asymptotically approaching zero over the next 50 years, right? And
Yeah,
now my PDUM is like, I don't know, 5% over the next 20 years, something like that, right?
yeah,
Like
makes sense.
there is something in my mind that says like, okay, like we're, you know, unlikely, but it could certainly happen, in the next, 2 decades or so. And some people's, PDUMs are way different, right? I think I'm more on the conservative side of things when I said my answer. But you're right. Like we're actually talking about that, and we don't sound like we've taken crazy pills either, right? Like
Yeah.
we can, logically lead to this conclusion without, too much stress on any particular system. So that's both exciting, daunting, exhilarating, and somewhat scary at the same time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is something that we'll need to better understand as a society. It's not necessarily technical aspects only, but it's also the way that we as a society will embrace that. And I want to ask you our last question. You made a lot of investment in the Israeli ecosystem, specifically in AI companies. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. What most excites you about the Israeli AI ecosystem, what you are looking for, how it's different regarding to other areas in the world. So, and anything that you should elaborate more on that, or maybe Israeli companies who want to reach out. I'll be happy to hear your thought about that.
Well, first of all, I think I'll start by saying, my complete exposure to the Israeli ecosystem really didn't start in earnest until I joined Insight, and then of course, joining Insight and being part of the journey at Explorium and Pecan and Deep Dub, and
Hmm.
of course, helping Jonathan on the journey with Desi, and more recently working with Vect and what
Hmm.
Adam's doing, in terms of really sort of considering the next generation of or parameter management and settings for all SaaS enterprises. Like all of these things kind of gave me, I would say, a faster accelerated course towards really understanding the Israeli ecosystem and working very closely with some of the most incredible founders in the world. And I cannot be more thrilled with how much the Israeli ecosystem in particular not only has embraced, the startup nation that it's always been, but really embraced the idea that it can be the AI startup nation that it is
Yeah.
today and will continue to be. And that's as much about, what the Israeli startup ecosystem is and has always been, but it's in a lot of ways, in a positive way, accelerating because of
Hmm.
the opportunity around AI. So I'm incredibly excited for this next decade that's ahead of us. Now, there's just a lot that we're all going through, particularly as
Hmm.
Israeli founders and investors in Israeli companies this past year. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously with the war, we have teams that have had 20% of their workforces being, deployed,
Recruited.
right,
Yeah.
and recruited back to to just work through the conflict that's in front of us. And so that has had a real impact, right? I don't think there's any way to um, you know underestimate the impact of you know the not only the war itself from an emotional and physical and psychological standpoint, but also just the reality of just you don't have as much people to go build the companies that you're building. So I just look forward to some reasonable resolution wherever it can, and that we can get back to, building
And
the
deliver,
startup
yeah.
nation that Israel
Focusing
is,
on
right?
delivery, okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and certainly there's no lack of incredible AI research, AI leadership, AI founders that have been thinking about the same issues that you and I are talking about today, Uri, that are
Mhm.
ready to build for this next decade. And that's where I'm tremendously excited by the opportunity ahead of us in Israel.
Sounds amazing, and thank you for the support. Not taken for granted. And that's it. So thank you a lot, George. It was fascinating, and I wish we had a couple more hours to speak and talk about those topics. It was very, very interesting. And that's it. So thank you very much for joining us. And I hope we will have another time to have this another session in the near future. And that's it. Thank you.
Appreciate that very much, Uri. I'm personally looking forward to spending more time sooner than later in Tel Aviv, as I was, last year. Of course, I have not been able to come, since October. So as soon as I can come, I will be there. And as you know, Insight is here for all of our portfolio companies everywhere in the world. But certainly, Israel is a place that is special to our hearts, and we continue
Mhm.
to want to be there for the most impressive founders in the world that have come from Israel. And we look forward to the next decade ahead together.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Uri.